All right, so one more to go for this chapter, and this one's a short one, so this should only take about 15, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Computers run a little bit weird. There we go. So we have talked about the sensory division of the nervous system and some sensory pathways, and we talked a little bit about motor. We've been mentioning the autonomic nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But the peripheral nervous system, the motor division, actually has two major divisions. One is the somatic nervous system, and one's the autonomic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system innervates only skeletal muscle. And that skeletal muscle can be under conscious control, meaning you can consciously think about moving it, like if you flex or extend your knee, or flex or extend your elbow, or roll your eyes at me, or shrug your shoulders. That's conscious movement. There's also subconscious movement that you don't have to think about. So it happens without your conscious thought. And remember, so the somatic nervous system uses two neurons, the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. So this somatic nervous system, basically the lower motor neurons are controlled by reflexes in the spinal cord and the brain. And then the upper motor neurons also control lower motor neurons. Their cell bodies are located in the primary motor cortex. So there's a bunch of different ways that your body can monitor the activity in a lower motor neuron. They can be involved in a reflex from the spinal cord to the brain, or they can be involved in a more complicated pathway coming in basically from integrated information from sensory neurons to the brain, the primary sensory cortex, and the primary sensory cortex can communicate to the primary motor cortex, where the cell bodies of upper motor neurons are located. And then those upper motor neurons communicate to lower motor neurons as well. Lots of stuff going on here, fancy pathways sometimes, right? So here's the upper motor neurons. Cell bodies are located in the primary motor cortex. Remember, it's the precentral gyrus, right? Here's the postcentral gyrus, which is where the primary sensory cortex is located. So the primary motor cortex has cell bodies of upper motor neurons that then the axons leaving from those areas synapse on the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons here in the brainstem or even the spinal cord. And then those lower motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle. And that skeletal muscle is controlled by those lower motor neurons, and that basically controls your body movement, both conscious and subconsciously. So depending on, I'm going to flip back to that slide, depending on where this synapse is located between the upper and lower motor neuron, the lower motor neurons will innervate skeletal muscle nearby. So it could be a skeletal muscle of the upper body, upper arm or upper, the trunk, or skeletal muscle if it's further down the spinal cord, this synapse is. Could be muscles of the lower legs or the upper legs, right? The synapses that occur here, the lower motor neurons likely innervate muscles in the head and neck, right, in the trunk area. As opposed to, usually you'll never have a lower motor neuron that has its cell body located in the brainstem that would innervate muscle all the way down in your toes. That would be a lower motor neuron that has its cell body somewhere down here in maybe the lower lumbar region. The autonomic nervous system, again, these are the two divisions of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system that innervates skeletal muscle and skeletal muscle only. And then the autonomic nervous system that innervates everything else. So internal organs and glands. So basically that function outside of our awareness. So like the autonomic nervous system can change heart rate. You don't ever have to think about changing your heart rate, right? You don't have to think, gosh, if I need to go outside and exercise, I need to go increase my heart rate. No, you don't have to think about that. Your autonomic nervous system does that for you without you ever having to think about it. And most of the integrating centers for this autonomic function are in the hypothalamus. And we've also talked about some other areas like the medulla oblongata and the pons that have additional integrating centers that work with the hypothalamus to modulate, basically control this autonomic function. And instead of a single lower motor neuron like the somatic nervous system uses, there's actually two motor neurons that are in series that work together in the autonomic nervous system. One's called the preganglionic neuron. Think before the ganglia, preganglionic. The cell bodies are located in the brainstem or the spinal cord, and they're part of basically visceral reflex arcs. And the preganglionic neurons synapse on and communicate with ganglionic neurons. And these ganglionic neurons, their cell body is located in the ganglia. So the preganglionic neurons are before the ganglia. Remember, a ganglia is a collection of cell bodies. So preganglionic neurons, their cell bodies are in the brainstem, located in the brainstem and the spinal cord. And their axons leave the brainstem and the spinal cord and synapse somewhere in the peripheral nervous system in a ganglia. So they'll synapse on another cell body where the cell bodies are clustered together in ganglia. Those are called autonomic ganglia. And basically those ganglionic neurons, their axons leave the ganglia and innervate target tissues like cardiac muscle, heart, smooth muscle in like blood vessels and the walls of digestive system organs, glands, and fat tissue, adipose tissue. So here's the hypothalamus up here, where you've got a control and integrating center. This cell body located here, its axon leaves and synapses on the preganglionic neuron cell body located in the brainstem. There's another preganglionic neuron cell body located in the spinal cord. So these are preganglionic neurons. Their axons leave the central nervous system and synapse on ganglionic cell bodies in the ganglia. And then the postganglionic axons, or the axons of the ganglionic neurons, innervate all the effector tissues. So there's two neurons instead of one lower motor neuron in the somatic nervous system. There's actually two neurons that are utilized in this pathway to modulate the effector tissues. And again, the effector tissues are heart, smooth muscle, glands, cardiac muscle, which is in the heart, and fat cells. So anything that's not skeletal muscle is likely innervated by something in the autonomic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, so the autonomic nervous system has two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we've mentioned this before. The preganglionic neurons are located, the cell bodies of these neurons are located in the spinal cord and the thoracic and lumbar regions only. So you'll never find, there are no preganglionic cell bodies of parasympathetic neurons in those same segments. They're dedicated to just the sympathetic nervous system. And there's three locations of ganglionic neurons. So there's three locations in the sympathetic nervous system of ganglia, collections of cell bodies. One's called the sympathetic chain ganglia. They're located right near the spinal cord. One's called the collateral ganglia, and another one is the adrenal medulla. So the adrenal gland has a cortex. We'll talk about the cortex later when we get to the endocrine system. The medulla, the innermost portion of the adrenal gland that sits right on top of your kidney, that adrenal gland, its innermost component is actually a location of the sympathetic neurons. So it's considered its own ganglia. And it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So it's a little bit different. It's modified ganglion, as opposed to a typical collection of cell bodies that would then have axons that innervate a target tissue. The axons and the cell bodies of the ganglionic neurons are all located in the adrenal medulla, and they release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So they're a little bit funky. So here they are. The sympathetic chain ganglia, they run right alongside the spinal cord, and those ganglionic neurons innervate visceral tissues, so organs, glands, in the thoracic cavity. So think heart and lungs, the head, the wall of the body, so think skin, and limbs, so skin and blood vessels maybe in the limbs, right? So blood vessels and skin there as well. The collateral ganglia, there's actually three of them. They innervate those ganglionic neurons, their axons innervate visceral tissues in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So think digestive system organs and some urinary and reproductive organs. So think stomach, spleen, pancreas, small and large intestine, that kind of thing. those kinds of organs. And the adrenal medulla is, again, a little bit of a different guy, because the adrenal medulla, the innermost portion of the adrenal gland, secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So these are not neurotransmitters, but neurohormones. And those can be secreted into the blood and then circulate throughout the whole body. So these axons in the sympathetic division are really short. The as my dog, the preganglionic fibers, so the axons of preganglionic neurons are really short, and they release acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter that is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine acts very similar to what we talked about back in skeletal muscle to depolarize a cell, or we talked about it in the nervous system, I believe. The nervous system, basically that acetylcholine is used to activate the ganglionic cell body to stimulate and generate another action potential. So preganglionic fibers, axons, release acetylcholine onto ganglionic cell bodies. There are really long postganglionic axons that release norepinephrine. So the sympathetic nervous system, its end result, basically by using these two neurons, is to release neurotransmitter, norepinephrine, onto the target tissue, the effector tissue, to cause a response. And those responses are basically increases in metabolic rate, increases in heart rate and blood pressure, activation of sweat glands. So think about your fight or flight response. If you're, going for a run, or if somebody scares you and you need to run away from a very emergent situation, activating energy reserves, increasing your breathing rate. All of these 7 functions are sympathetic nervous system functions. In response to norepinephrine being released from ganglionic axons and causing a response in the target tissue. Remember, those target tissues are like heart and lungs. So increasing heart rate, increasing blood pressure, increasing breathing rate, which is respiratory rate, and dilating airways. So all those responses are in response, the responses in the target tissues are in response to norepinephrine being released. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are located in the brain, and they're part of cranial nerves. So there's axons that are motor, part of cranial nerves, and they're cranial nerves 3. Remember, cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. 9 is the glossopharyngeal, and 10 is the vagus. There's other preganglionic neurons that are part of the sacral segment of the spinal cord. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system has cell bodies of neurons in the thoracic and lumbar region. The parasympathetic division has cell bodies of preganglionic neurons in the brainstem and sacral segments of the spinal cord. And the ganglionic neurons are not located near the spinal cord anymore, but actually near the target tissue. One of the two, there's two areas of ganglionic neuronal cell bodies. So there's two areas where ganglia are located in the parasympathetic nervous system. One's called a terminal ganglia, which is ganglia that's actually right next to the target organ. So you'll see a terminal ganglia like near one of the target organs, like the heart or the lungs. The intramural ganglia is actually embedded in the tissue of the target organ. That's usually in clusters. So they're not actually in like outside of that target tissue, but actually within it. And both preganglionic axons and postganglionic axons, remember, postganglionic axons are the axons of ganglionic neurons after the ganglia. They both release acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the only neurotransmitter used in the parasympathetic nervous system. And when that neurotransmitter is released, you have some major responses. So take a look here. There's the cranial nerves. There's the location of the cranial nerves. So this is the location of cell bodies of preganglionic neurons. Their axons head to either terminal ganglia, which are ganglia located near the target tissue that maybe control like pupil dilation and lens, the shape of the lens. Again, ganglia that are close to, so nasal glands, tear glands, so those are the lacrimal glands, any of the salivary glands in around the mouth. Intramural ganglia are located within the tissue, so visceral organs of the neck and thoracic cavity and most of the abdominal cavity. I think I made a mistake on the previous slide and said the terminal ganglia were near the heart. I think that the intramural ganglia are actually in the heart. So, and then there's the pelvic nerves as well. So the cell bodies of preganglionic neurons are located here in the blue, and here in the blue. The red are the axons that leave. So here's the location of the ganglia, ganglionic neuron cell bodies, and then the points of innervation, the target tissues or effector tissues for those postganglionic axons that would release acetylcholine. And they release acetylcholine to cause these effects, for the most part, which are the opposite of sympathetic nervous system, decreasing metabolic rate, whereas the sympathetic nervous system increased heart rate and blood pressure. The parasympathetic nervous system decreases heart rate and blood pressure. And one more note back here on this slide. Remember I said cranial nerve 10 when we talked about cranial nerves in the last slide, or in the last lecture for chapter 8A. The vagus nerve makes up most of this innervation. So you've got some minor innervation from cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9. The vagus nerve makes up 75% of the innervation for all of these organs here. So the salivary, the visceral organs of the neck, thoracic cavity, and most of the abdominal cavity. So basically the vagus nerve makes up the majority of innervation by way of parasympathetic nervous system. Increases, so this is, remember, rest and digest. So to digest, increasing saliva secretion and digestive gland secretion, increasing motility and blood flow to the digestive tract, and stimulating urination and defecation. So this is basically the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system would stimulate. The parasympathetic nervous system stimulates these things when acetylcholine is released. And there's kind of a summary slide of characteristics of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So there's like the short preganglionic axon, the long postganglionic axon of the sympathetic nervous system. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic axon has a really long axon, and post is really short. There's target tissues. There's just some differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. All right, and that does it for chapter 8. So I will see you in chapter 9.